Another big news day, lots to get through. Joining me now is senior writer and columnist at the Herald Sun, Patrick Carlyon. Patrick, welcome to the program.
Hi, Rita.
Let's start with the protest in Melbourne. We saw a little bit of footage of it. They targeted the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in the centre of the city. They caused significant disruption. Premier Jacinta Allen was asked about the ongoing protest. She had this to say.
And they're continuing to see reports of children, particularly in some of the most difficult set of circumstances, regardless of which part of the Middle East you live in. This is what they're being experienced right now.
Look, she talked about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. There seems to be this determination to both sides this issue, but it's the Jewish students who need their own safe rooms at university. It's the Jewish schools that have just had to up security to ridiculous levels. I'm not sure both siding this is sound.
Well, Jacinta Allen is a new Premier, as we well know. She's been very cautious. I think on October 8th, the day after the massacre in Israel, we saw her refuse to use the word terrorism to describe it. And she's been very cautious. And I think, look, she said quite rightly, it's her paramount job to make sure that the peace is kept. And I think she's been politically expedient in this case and sort of covering all bases. That will offend some people in the Jewish community, I would think. But she's cautious so far.
She is very cautious, and we're going to talk about this with the international panel later, because I think Labor have got a problem right through their ranks when it comes to this issue. Now, right across the world, journalists have questioned the severity of Hamas's terror attacks, including some at our own ABC. But today, gruesome footage of Hamas's militants murdering hundreds of Israeli civilians was aired for a group of Australian journalists, marking the first time the horrific video, which includes bodycam footage of Hamas terrorists, being shown outside of Israel. It's shocking, Patrick, that this needs to happen, that there is still so much doubt about what actually occurred on October 7, that they feel the need to show the proof, the brutal reality of what happened.
Well, I'm glad I myself don't have to watch this video. It just sounds terrible, the sort of stuff that would haunt you for life.
Absolutely.
And I think you're right, it is terribly sad. We've seen it across the Western world, especially universities, where a massacre of innocent people has sort of been used as a default clarion call, if you like, for change in the region. And that's not right. You can't do that. This was a massacre. It's not a starting point for change. And I think it's really important that you look at Israel's response to it, and you look at, say, the response to ISIS in Mosul in, I think, 2017. That was seen as a just war. There was 8,000 civilian casualties, and 50 journalists, I think, died as well. Israel is not commanding the same sort of sentiment and respect, and I think this is them saying, well, we need the world to understand what happened here.
I spoke to one of the journalists who saw this footage when Israel showed it to 200 foreign press, and he was in tears recounting what he saw. I think you're 100% right. He's going to be impacted by that for the rest of his life. You can't unsee that horror. Now, the PM has claimed that the failed voice referendum was never about him, only to then have a crack at his counterpart Peter Dutton and former Prime Ministers for promising to hold referendums and failing to do so. Anthony Albanese also declared that we need to find a different path to achieve reconciliation. Patrick, he's still funding the Macarata, the treaty-making commission. Is that the new path? Is that the answer to reconciliation?
Well, we just had a referendum, didn't we? And 6 in 10 Australians said no to the questions. And part of that reluctance to support it was this notion that there was a truth-telling part aspect to the voice that would follow, that there would be treaties enacted following that. People were suspicious. And people, I think every decent Australian believes in reconciliation. They don't believe in looking backwards and sort of, being forced to feel shame or guilt. Everybody wants better outcomes going forward. And I think Jacinta Price did a wonderful job of actually explaining we need changes looking ahead. We don't need to look backwards. We've just spent all year looking at the voice, looking backwards. We're sick of it. We're fatigued. We want to move on. And everybody wants reconciliation, but this is not it.
I don't think it's and like you said, the Australian people have spoken. It's unequivocal. It wasn't close.
Yes.
And yet we're going down this treaty making. Like, why are we having this when we know if you voted no to the voice, then if you were having a referendum on the treaty, it would be what, 9 out of 10 voting no? The figures would be even more emphatic. You mentioned Jacinta Price, former ABC journo and Indigenous activist Stan Grant. Well, he's still emoting wildly and with some fairly remarkable commentary in a speech he gave. He also did have a veiled crack at Senator Price, describing her as the victorious politician who says this no vote puts an end to the politics of grievance and who waves away generational trauma as mere contrivance. Well, yes. And he also said the politician has no tolerance for history. Pain is negated by progress. Well, pain is negated by progress. I mean, do we want to be always looking backwards and looking at the pain of our ancestors, or do we want to improve outcomes right now and for our children?
Well, I think, look, I mean, he talked about racism in his speech last night. I thought he got a few things very on the mark. He talked about this being a monumental change rather than an inoffensive, I think.
Well, that's right. He said it wasn't, as Anthony Albanese claimed, a modest proposal. Yes. That was interesting.
But what I think of, I went up to some Indigenous communities back in August up in Cape York. They weren't talking about the voice. They were very cynical about the voice. A lot of them were, among the, I think it's 37% of Indigenous people actually voted no. Are we going to call them cold-hearted? Are we going to call them racist? It's silly, and it is time to move on, really.
Well, the electorates with the biggest Indigenous populations, the top 5 were emphatic no's, if that means anything. And interestingly, some of the strongest yes votes were for electorates, including mine, that have next to no Indigenous population, 0.2% in Goldstein, for example. So, yeah, that was an interesting trend. Now to the ACT, and several legal experts from across the country, including the Law Council of Australia, have warned that no, actually, I'm going to go to Labor's misinformation bill first, then the ACT. Labor's misinformation bill, it's been described, Patrick, as dangerous for civil rights. We've got barristers like Margaret Cunneen saying that it's a threat to free speech. This looks like the next big national fight. Are the coalition up to it? They've just had a victory with the voice. This is going to be, I think, another one that is going to really energise the coalition base.
Well, you'd really hope that they're up for it, because this is the wording of this bill is dangerous, and it turns the tenets of of legal practice that have been there for hundreds of years on their head. If you're accused of murder or of rape, you have the right to silence. You don't have to incriminate yourself. Under these proposals, as they are. And it all sounds very Big Brother, doesn't it? Orwellian in the sense of media or government media regulators who will decide what is misinformation, and that they might have the power to coerce people to testify. Sorry, that just goes against everything. And you've got some, very, very heavy-hitting legal bodies nationally saying this is wrong, this is dangerous, stop.
Absolutely it is. And if we've learned anything over the last 3 years, is that what's considered misinformation today is gospel truth a couple of years later. I mean, look at all the things we were told during COVID about everything from wearing masks outdoors to vaccines stopping transmission. And, when you question that, you were called someone who's spreading disinformation. Now, to the ACT, and Dr. Long, a senior research fellow at Charles Sturt University, is Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. They're saying that the ACT's new euthanasia laws would be not only the most liberal in Australia, but would open the door to state-sponsored suicide. This is concerning, Patrick, because they're talking about getting rid of the life expectancy requirements that the other states have in place. What do you think? I mean, the ACT, the only state that voted yes for the voice, it is the most left-leaning, sorry, not only state, only territory, it is the most left-leaning state or territory. This shouldn't be a surprise.
Look, I think, the ACT was talking about considering letting teenagers
14-year-olds.
14-year-olds. That life expectancy provision is built in for a very good reason. It puts checks and balances on the ability to pursue, an assisted death. To not have those checks and balances, you end up using words like liberal and euthanasia in the same sentence. That's scary. That is very scary.
It is, and when you look at those Benelux countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, which brought in euthanasia a long time ago, that slippery slope is real, folks, because they do have state-sponsored suicide. You can have the state kill you for having emotional pain. You don't even have to have a life-threatening illness. Patrick Carlyon, thank you so much for joining me tonight.